I thank everybody for joining us today. We are happy to share with you the answer to the problems of civilization. We at Edgar J. Ridley and Associates are behavioral scientists with particular emphasis on behavior transformation. Our consulting practice was designed by our founder and chairman, Edgar J. Ridley, whom you will hear from today. Our unique expertise in cognitive semiotics and behavioral epigenetics addresses symbolism and its impact on human behavior by examining the damage wrought by mythology, rituals, and superstition among the world's cultures. We then go further to train our global clients how to change their mindset to introduce productivity using a trademark tool for behavior change invented by Edgar J. Ridley called the Symptomatic Thought Process. We're sharing that with you today. So our goal for today's workshop is to recognize the damaging impact of symbolic thought on human behavior. See if we can move that down. We want to explore and appreciate our own implicit biases when thinking symbolically and develop an awareness for changing the mindset using a symptomatic thought process. We'll accomplish that with a mix of modalities, lecture, video, and audience interaction. As we can see from the theme of this conference, there are many strategies to facilitate intercultural exchange around the world. However, there is always a missing link. As we approach intercultural learning, it is imperative that we appreciate the foundations that drive our training. We have conducted qualitative research that consistently examines how decisions are made with mythology and superstition as their main ingredients. We have a solution, a facilitative tool due to the groundbreaking research of Edgar J. Ridley, known as a symptomatic thought process. So what is this symptomatic thought process? This is a trademarked methodology that is the outgrowth of pioneering research done over the past 5 decades. It examines the impact of symbols and symbolic thought on human behavior by behavioral scientist Edgar J. Ridley. This management concept has been implemented globally with managers and students from ASEAN countries, Europe, and Africa, as well as the Americas. Briefly defined, symbolic thought includes a belief in mythology, rituals, and superstition. This thinking makes it easy to ignore history. Our efforts to build an inclusive, intercultural environment are hampered by our unwillingness to confront truth and reality. Edgar Ridley provides a new groundbreaking paradigm, a shift from symbolic thought to symptomatic thought, after which there is a liberating approach that allows us to confront the myths and omission currently within our learning environments. It is essential that we understand the origins of symbolic thought. So many attendees today may have little engagement around the topic of symbols and symbolic thought. So why don't we shift gears for a moment? Let's look at a brief video.
Modern human culture is embedded in symbols. So when I get up in the morning,
If we can get
I
those
dress,
down.
the way I dress actually sends messages
Let's
about
try
who
that
I am,
again.
how I conceive of myself. So everything I do is symbolic. The kind of car I drive is symbolic. The church I go to is symbolic. All of these things stand for something else, and everybody else can interpret the fact.
I'm going to start it over so we can hear it.
Modern human culture is embedded in symbols. So when I get up in the morning and I dress, the way I dress actually sends messages about who I am, how I conceive of myself. So everything I do is symbolic. The kind of car I drive is symbolic. The church I go to is symbolic. All of these things stand for something else, and everybody else can interpret the fact that they stand for something else.
There are many things that make human beings unique as a species. There are many physical peculiarities, but the one that makes us feel unique is our extraordinary symbolic mental capacity. We disassemble the world around us. We break it down into a mass of symbols that we give names to, and then we recombine those symbols to remake the world in our heads. And in a very real way, we live in a world of our own making. Clearly, you need a whole bunch of different mental capacities in order to indulge in abstract thought. And we don't know what the key capacity was. We don't know what it was exactly that was added at the moment that humans began to express the abstract symbolic cognitive style. But clearly, it's a product of the human brain. And the human brain is the product of 350 million years of vertebrate evolution.
What we see initially in human evolution is bipedalism. It looks as if that appeared perhaps as early as 5 million years ago, but they don't give us any impression that they're more than bipedal apes. About 1.5 million years ago, we get one of the really big jumps in evolution. Brain size was about 85% of modern brain size. Body build was much more modern. Then about 500,000 years ago, cranial capacity comes up almost to modern range. In Europe, they evolve into Neanderthals. In Africa, they evolve into Homo sapiens. So anatomically, modern humans are in place by 200,000 years ago.
Human physical remains tell us what people looked like, how tall they were, how big their brains were, information like that. But that's all they tell you about the capacity of humans. They don't tell you how humans behaved. And that's where you need to rely on the material artifacts, the artifacts you recover from the sites that people lived in. We're in Blombos Cave in the Southern Cape, South Africa. And we've been excavating here for many years because this cave contains important evidence of the origins of modern human behavior. What we're looking at here is what's called a section. This is the deposits that were brought into the cave that were left behind by people who lived here hundreds or perhaps thousands of years ago. And each time that people came into the cave, they brought food with them, they brought various materials with them. They left the materials in the cave, and that's what's caused these lines you can see against this wall over here. Some of the most interesting finds have been below this orange sand layer, which dates to about 72 to 77,000. And this indicates to us a very, very early period for people using material artifacts in a symbolic way. Some of the artifacts we have over here, these are some of the beads, which date to about 75,000 years ago. They're made on a small shell. And what they've done is they've pierced a hole through the mouth of the shell to create a hole that they could string the bead to make perhaps a necklace. And I think there's one point that all archaeologists agree on, is that beads are typical markers of symbolic behavior, or behavior that's mediated by symbolism again.
Is this it? No, I think it's just stained with a bit of ochre. Okay. I think it is a little chip of ochre, but very, very small. I don't want to stretch it now, but if I did, the color would show up much better.
Ochre is becoming one of our prime finds. This is a very nice piece. It's been worked, it's been scraped on the one edge over here. It may have been used in this kind of way, that people smoothed it across their skin like that, which would have left a red mark almost like a red lipstick. We know certainly in contemporary societies that people use ochre very strongly to indicate affinities or sexual status, a whole lot of things, in fact.
There is still some discussion about the exact implications of the findings at Blombos Cave, but the interpretation of bodily adornment certainly has been recently reinforced by discoveries in the Levant and in North Africa. So there's some consistency here.
I think Blombos Cave gave us really the first solid information that humans were using symbols at 77,000 years ago. We now know that people did not evolve modern type behavior in Europe. They were already modern before they left Africa. So our previous understanding of Europe being the cradle of modernity has now been overturned, and Africa is now back in the spotlight again.
Okay. As Professor Tattersall stated in the video, we live in a world of our own making. Then there's no wonder why there's such confusion. We all may be filtering information that we encounter in many different ways. So, as we could see in the video, we have been surrounded by symbolic behavior and interpretation since the dawn of humanity. Very importantly, we saw with Christopher Henshelwood's archaeological research, he looked at the symptoms he found in Blombos Cave. There was a specific application of how a shift from symbolic thought to a symptomatic approach allowed us to view history accurately. So put very simply, a symptomatic approach provides the opportunity to recognize the presence of mythology and superstition in our thinking practices, including religious beliefs and racial bias. This is an endless exercise that should be applied to all areas of people activity, which then permits clear thought devoid of symbolic impact. So Edgar Ridley's cutting-edge research challenges our conventional understanding of symbols and their usage in society as he examines the damage caused by symbolic behavior. He posits that primordial humanity's propensity to symbolize is a neurological misadventure. So now let's hear from the inventor of the symptomatic thought process, Edgar J. Ridley.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. A major study done by the National Research Council of the National Academies emphasizes that Americans still see African Americans as somehow different from other racial and ethnic groups. They state that African Americans have the fewest ethnic options of any group in the United States. It must be understood that we are in a global race war. People who classify themselves as white are determined to do whatever is necessary to delude the possibility of any Black achievements. There are only two possible ways to live in the world: through symbolic thinking and expression, or symptomatic thinking and expression. Symbols have caused all of the problems humans face today in the world. Symbols have created racism and religion, which are the two factors that people have been killing each other over ever since the beginning of time. We must understand that all of our behaviors are based on those two facts: symptomatic thinking and or thinking in symbols. Thinking in symbols have caused all the problems that we face today. As an international management consultant, my emphasis has always been to solve problems, to solve global problems for my clients. As an African in the United States, I've always been interested in the problems of Africa and its relation to the rest of the world. After years of research, it became apparent to me that the problems of the universe were tied to symbolism and its resulting mythology and superstition. It is universally accepted that symbols started in Africa and produced a scenario where mythology was a basic for decision making. And human activity. This is uncontested. It became increasingly clear to me that mythology, which was created by symbolism, had to be given a new look. Mythology has created the superstitions that have hindered human behavior and good mental health for centuries. An example is in Africa, where we have had internal warfare and a pathetic, if not absurd, dependency on Europeans and the West to solve our problems rather than depending on our African genius for problem solving. It was stated in UNESCO General History of African series that myth governed history and was at the same time responsible for justifying it. As we it was stated, let's see where it's, when people make decisions out of mythology, you have chaos, wars, and anarchy. We see taking place all over Africa. However, let me be clear. This dynamic is not only happening on the African continent, but globally as well. Whether India versus Pakistan, Russia versus Ukraine, or in the United States, with slides towards authoritarianism. My discovery changed behavior like nothing before. Scientists now are focusing on genes and DNA and how they can be permanent in the lives of Homo sapiens. The reason there is so much focus on genes is because genes are used as a weapon on all Black people to distort their history, their behavior, and control their minds. Our minds have been controlled by symbolic behavior that has been perpetuated on us by people who classify themselves as white. They have had about, they have lied about African history, and they have lied about what African people have done, have accomplished. And at the end, their goal is to exterminate Black people as a whole. One thing must be understood, that Black people are the most hated people in the world. They are I've been all over the world, and I've come to the conclusion that we are indeed the most hated people. And there's reasons for that. The leading proponent of ancient DNA concept, Harvard, David writes, is author of Who We Are and How We got here. The book is racist to the core and has rights tried to turn back the clock by emphasizing racial differences in the genome debate with a fixation on denying the African people are their mothers and fathers, which was opposed by 67 scholars worldwide from disciplines ranging across the natural sciences, medical and population health sciences, social sciences, law, and humanities. They stated that rich use of genetics as a source of human differences, with race playing a leading role, is seriously flawed. I agree with the 67 scholars who oppose David Wright Rich research. As they said, the social, economic, and cultural differences and sampling all shapes the genome. We know that as a secondary sense, my concept of symptomatic thought process is primary, and it overrides shapes, behavior, and epigenetics. And experiment science that seeks to, epigenetics is an experiment science that seeks to explain how nature shapes, nurture shapes nature. The research of Rich and his academic colleagues are examples of the danger of symbolic thought. The history of humanity is discovered through a symptomatic process. African participation in world history is becoming known symptomatically by discovering natural signs. Scientists, just as the late Luca Cavalli starts in his book, The History and Geography of Human Genes, left no doubt about the importance that genetics play throughout the history of mankind. Genetics and the evolution of DNA are natural signs that are found in all humans. These natural signs become symptomatic as they are described. The findings of DNA is in agreement with the fossil finding by anthropologists. A symptomatic thought process that I created eradicates racism by changing behavior. My trademark method is to encourage a shift from symbolic thought to symptomatic thought and behavior. This has not been done before. Unless that process is implemented, civilization will be destroyed, whether through reckless use of atomic weapons or deliberately savage behavior that will cause catastrophes all over the universe. We must eradicate symbolic thinking and behavior so that humanity will not become a world of barbarism.
John Dewey had some observations regarding symbols. Let's take a look at this. And his observation about symbols laid the groundwork on the thinking processes of humans that dictates their behavior patterns. So you can kind of understand the reasons for Dewey's statement. Scholars do concur that symbolism created all religion and made possible enormous intellectual advances and development. Indeed, symbolism has been embedded in the human intellectual fabric to such an extent that biological anthropologist Terence Deacon has taken the term Homo sapiens and renamed it Homo symbolicus. There's no doubt that most would agree that the discovery or invention of symbolism is the greatest event in human history. So if we understand how symbolism has played a role in human activity, we also have to recognize that symbolism was invented and discovered in Africa by Black Africans. Indeed, when white scholars deny that fact, they usually introduce a mythological concept that Black Africans were actually white. And we see here just the converse. We see Christopher Henchwood again, where he has some of his archaeological findings juxtaposed against another anthropologist who might not agree. So with the in-depth research and ransacking of the world's literature that has been done by Edgar Ridley, you find that symbolism was actually a huge debacle. Because when man began to symbolize, he underwent that neurological misadventure we talked about. That neurological misadventure of primordial man is what was named by Edgar Ridley. That's the greatest discovery ever made in the history of the world. Brings us to the symptomatic thought process. And that initiates that symptomatic behavior in place of a symbolic thought process. We have some observations by an unlikely anthropologist, Neil Shubin. He made a statement that was very, very powerful, where he talked about fear and suspicion should not be an excuse for man to turn to superstition to explain his experiences of the unknown. And so we were fortunate to have multiple volumes by Edgar Ridley that specifically addresses the neurological misadventure that humans underwent as they began to think and act out symbolically. And we showed you that earlier with the multiple volumes of work that he's done. That was a defining moment when humans began to act out. And that's what gave us our global conflicts, our wars, and the destruction that would occur throughout civilization to this day. That is the missing link that we talk about. We'll show you the equation that was developed that gives us that symptomatic thought process.
Let me interject something.
Okay, let me stop here. Go ahead.
Symbolic thinking is a mental illness. Let me repeat this. Symbolic thinking is a mental illness. If symbolic thinking never left Africa, there would be no racism or religion in the world, period. That is an important understanding of human behavior. Symbolism produced all religions in the world. Symbolism produced all the racism in the world. In order to be sane in the world we live in today, symbolic thinking must be destroyed. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. When we think about the beginning of all symbolic thought and behavior, we say that that is Africa. We know that that is Africa. We talked about some of the findings of UNESCO, who did a fantastic study. I thought that we had a visual on that, but that's okay, because we want to emphasize people are not really cogent and understanding of how mythology distorted man's behavior since humans began to act out symbolically. And so since we don't have that proper understanding of the reality of mythology and its functions in dictating the behavior of humans, the vast majority of the population takes mythology for granted. And so we underestimate how colonized we are by mythology and how mythology is controlling our behavior. So when we look at such things as racism, we take it for granted. We show here a famous psychiatrist who actually approached the American Psychiatric Association.
Tom, where is he from?
And
Harvard.
Dr. Alan Poussaint was from Harvard Medical School. He's professor of psychiatry emeritus. He just recently passed. And this heading, They Hate, They Kill, Are They Insane, is Dr. Poussaint's approach to the American Psychiatric Association when they were rewriting the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. They only rewrite it every decade or so. And he told them, he says, well, you've got to put in there that racism is a mental illness. And the APA said, we can't do that. And why did they say that? Because they said racism is a norm of American society. So you cannot say it is a mental illness. And we see, on the contrary, that racism is not only a mental illness, symbolic behavior subsequently is a mental illness. And when we think about such things as religion, we're simply looking at superstition and myth. And so we've had many, many scholars address that. Very importantly, I think we had Sheikh Ed.D up here, didn't we? Who talked about religion and its symbolic impact, because that's very important when we're talking about conflict in the world. The history of all religions has its origins in Africa. Religion was created by humanity as they sought to understand the mystery of the universe, which they feared. That fear introduced a desire to mythologize every event that was not understandable. And those myths, created in Africa, spread throughout the world by diffusion. So unfortunately, we have found that throughout history, there has been a mythological, symbolic reading of texts. And that incorrect reading has generated a behavior that then becomes normalized. So we look at a scholar such as Max Muller, who is a famous British scholar, and Muller addressed that behavior that has become normalized. I thought we had a visual on Max Muller, don't we? And he talked about the insanity that takes place during that mythological process. We don't have that, so we won't share that with you. We'll continue our discussion with Einstein in the background. But Max Muller reminded us that there's a direct link between man's mythological behavior during antiquity and man's decision-making in today's contemporary society. So it's important to appreciate that symbolic behavior and symbolism continues to colonize societies. And that is causing that destruction of civilization. We certainly see that today. Symbols referring to other symbols is circular, and that generates human behavior that is non-productive, incapable of solving problems. And this has tremendous impact on conflict resolution and diplomacy worldwide. So then we have what we call a falsification of history, and this oppresses people of color globally. We have the DNA studies that we talked about earlier. And
Einstein's figured out.
Yeah. And when we talk about scientific racism, it applies to the act of eliminating Black African identity. Scientific racism results in misleading, deceptive narratives that can only lead to disastrous consequences. And so when we look at an anthropologist like James Fraser, this is what he meant when he said that symbolism and mythological behavior are present in modern humans and civilization. Fraser posited that man progressed on a trajectory from magic in antiquity to religion and then science. So what Fraser didn't have an opportunity to foresee is that modern man in today's civilization has utilized mythology and superstition even more than primitive man. because of the truths revealed by science and technology. So if we move on, when we discuss the symptomatic thought process, we have a new tool invented by Edgar Ridley called a symptomatic neurological sampling. So we talk about James Frazer's Golden Bough, for instance. He was extremely thorough in unveiling symbolic thought and behavior in ancient and modern times. So he provided great value in explaining the results of symbolic behavior from ancient cultures to modern civilization. So when we move forward with symptomatic neurological sampling, this is forming a narrative of various experiences while using a symptomatic attitude. And that's the essence of symptomatic neurological sampling. Your qualitative experience can be as if you have actually been at the event firsthand. By assembling a collage of symptomatic experiences, you're using a symptomal reading practice, and you can fulfill the objective of sharing qualitatively those valuable narratives. That's what symptomatic neurological sampling is. Because it's important to understand, for the brain, memory is like reliving. A recent study on the brain showed that previous memory research focused on the recognition or recollection, not on specific symbols, but free recall, whatever popped into somebody's head. And in the study, people were asked to remember short film clips that they had just seen. And that free recall includes symptomatic experiences like sounds and smells that puts people in the realm of a symptomatic experience. These studies illustrate the power of reliving symptomatic life experiences through free recall. And these experiences can never be accomplished through a symbolic thought process, simply because symbolism has no connection to what it points. That's why it becomes mythological and creates superstition. So this is a big part of the symptomatic neurological sampling process. Symptomatic neurological sampling provides a non-biased type of sampling that transcends all other types of sampling practices, including quota sampling, probability sampling, non-probability sampling, and all other types of sampling that involve social research. So when we move over to something like gene editing techniques such as CRISPR, they made suggestions that those types of techniques can give us a more humane world. And that's a question about whether that can happen or not. Symptomatic thought process is the foundation that will enhance scientific discovery in unprecedented ways, that will ensure that technologies such as CRISPR will solve the world's global problems. There's no doubt that culture transcends the genome and other aspects of biology. When symptomatic thinking and behavior is expressed in the culture of humanity, it takes behavior epigenetics to an unparalleled level, where the behavior of people in their environment shapes the genome and how it is practiced in unparalleled ways.
Oh, they get all this information in my book.
This is all this material that we're talking about today, as we showed you, can be found in all of Edgar Ridley's work. His most recent book is The Golden Apple, the Anthology, Changing the Structure of Civilization. And this is a major treatise, 500 pages, as it were, that gives all of this background. Because there's no doubt that culture transcends the genome and other aspects of biology, as talked about in this book. When symptomatic thinking and behavior is expressed in the culture of humanity, it takes behavior epigenetics to an unparalleled level, where the behavior of people in their environment shapes the genome and how it is practiced in unparalleled ways. And that occurs when the transfer back to a symptomatic thought process and behavior is dominant in the cultures. The dynamics of ancient DNA is secondary and always will be. It was secondary in antiquity, and it will be secondary in the future. But the symptomatic thought process is primary, and it overrides and shapes behavior's epigenetics. So when we
Okay, I'll break in.
talk about Whitmont, I was going to mention Whitmont.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of the keys is that the understanding that thinking symptomatically is so huge in changing people's behavior. The vast majority of the people, because of being miseducated, refuse to understand and implement structures and discoveries that will change human behavior because of racism and because of a power drive.
Mhm.
Be sure to understand that symbolic behavior is indeed a mental illness. And that is unfortunate because the vast majority of Homo sapiens in the world today practice symbolic behavior. I have seen people kill each other over two issues: religion and race. I've been all over the world, served in the military, and has been fortunate to study under the greatest scholars in the world. Unfortunately, people who classify themselves as white have been miseducated. So the whole educational system is built on eugenics. Eugenics is the system of teaching the inferiority of Black people all over the world, that they are inferior genetically in every way. If we continue on the symbolic path, we will be destroyed. We will destroy ourselves by behaving symbolically. This is essential. Symbolic thinking must be eradicated. In the 5 books that I have written, it explains all the techniques that has to take place to live and think symptomatically. It changes lives. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I wanted
Show
to,
the books there.
yeah, the books are here. And I wanted to augment your comments with W. Edwards Deming
Yeah.
and what his opinion of, for instance, an example of how we are not really tapping the reservoir of what people are capable of. And Deming was the author of Out of the Crisis. Deming was well known. He was a global consultant who was lauded. Mhm. He was lauded for saving Japan. And he endorsed all these books here you see of Edgar Ridley's. W. Edwards Deming endorsed An African Answer, the Key to Global Productivity. And of course, he said it was a great book. And that was quite an honor. And W. Edwards Deming made a famous observation that the United States, because of the underdevelopment of its population, see if I have it here, we are that far behind. If we think about all of the people, all of the
We're the most underdeveloped country in the world.
All of the human capital that we have, for instance, in the United States, and we can certainly say that across the globe, it brings forth an underdevelopment. This is W. Edwards Deming. And that makes us the most underdeveloped country in the world. And we can certainly see that today with what is happening with today's environment in the United States.
The greatest consultant in history endorsed my concept.
So it's very exciting that the greatest consultant in history endorsed Edgar Ridley's symptomatic thought process. And he did that. If you happen to have Edgar Ridley's book, you'll see that notation on the back of the book. The book was An African Answer. And that goes back 40 years now, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's critical when we talk about this approach towards symbolic behavior, because what that brings us is the global wars where we are now. Symbolic behavior is what gets us in the situation we're in now. So when we talk about what the world is representing, Mr. Ridley talked about Black people being on the bottom the world over, about the approaches towards annihilating Black people. We see that here in the United States with the immigration laws being affected. We see people being picked up off the street when they go to check in, just as recently as yesterday. People from the African continent went in to check in for their immigration status, and they were rounded up very, very neatly and quietly, because we have what is effectively what Mr. Ridley started off with, a global race war. And we have to admit certain things. One of the problems that we see is there is a lot of discussion about the problem per se, but no solution. And the symptomatic thought process provides that solution. We're very excited to say that we work with governments as well as companies. So we spent over several decades in Malaysia, for instance, in the ASEAN countries, and as well as in Europe and Africa. And we are very excited to implement this work. And when we talk about fundamental work such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, intercultural learning, the implementation of the symptomatic thought process is integral to people making change in order for it to be effective.